I want to acknowledge that we're meeting on Ngunnawal country and really thank Wally for the welcome. That was fantastic. I also want to thank the organisers for inviting me to talk. And they've invited me to talk about something that, in fact, in truth, when I got the email saying this is your topic, I thought, oh, all right, that's kind of big. And then I saw I got 10 minutes. So I'm not really going to cover at all, but I just wanted to make a few key points, leave out plenty of others, but maybe we can talk about them later on. I'm a researcher with, I've been saying 20 years experience in research, but I've been saying that for the last 5 years, so I guess closer than 25, on pollinators and especially crop pollination and especially bees, so I'm a bit bee biased, but I'll talk about birds a little bit. Yeah, as a researcher, I'll tell you now, I'm going to show you some data. I was pleased that Cormac showed a graph. I'm going to show a few more. That's just the way I think and the way I work, but I'm hoping that if you don't like the graphs, I'm going to talk you through it anyway. So you can't really talk about climate variability right now without thinking about the summer we've just had. Other speakers have already raised that. And so I do want to look at, well, what do the bushfires mean to bees? And I'm actually going to start with kind of what I think is the bad news, if you like, even though the rest of the talk I hope will be optimistic. So there are cases where we have pollinators, beautiful pollinators, that as a species have very restricted distributions. And they're the ones we need to worry about in terms of possibly losing them. One example, in fact, I overheard someone talking about Great Carpenter Bees earlier, so I know that some of you in the room know about these guys. Carpenter bees are a big bee, they're bigger even than honeybees. A glamorous bee, most bees are small and black, but these guys are green and shiny, fantastic bee. In southern Australia, they were reduced to very few populations, and their best population by far was on Kangaroo Island, in country that's now been burned. So that population, we don't even know if it's still there. Thankfully, there are green carpenter bees further north in Australia, but that's an example of a single species that might be really harmed by fire. So that can happen. Hugendorn and Leys are colleagues of mine who work on this species and are somewhat worried about what's going on there. And then when we think about birds, regent honeyeater, an occasional visitor to this part of Australia. It's one of its best populations, or its single best population, was Kapiti Valley at the back of the Blue Mountains, and that's in one of the areas that's been heavily burned. So it's another one of these examples of, if you're a species that has a restricted distribution and the fire gets that last core population, it can be an existential threat to those species. So this is Ross, who works at the Fenner School, where I'm the director of the Fenner School. Ross and Rob have been working on this bird, and they're really worried about that one and what the future is. So that's kind of the tough news, and I don't want to ignore that there are some really troubling consequences of the fires. But actually, the message I want to focus on is that most of our native pollinators are really well adapted to a variable climate, for the obvious reason that Australia has a variable climate. They've had to deal with that for a long time. So I want to talk about a few ways in which we see that. This is kind of like, you could leave after this slide if you want. This is the main message I want to get through. We should expect resilience in our pollinators. So let's not think that they're all going to go because of climate change. But if we ask what can we do to help them, well, we should be trying to control climate change, of course. But we also want to remove those other threats. So the best ways to help organisms in the face of climate change, which is, climate change is hard to tackle, but we can take away some of those other threats, those compounding threats. So the big ones are habitat destruction, and people have talked about insecticides already. So I'll go back to this in the end, but there are things we can do, even if we're not succeeding in controlling climate change, and I won't talk about that too much. So here's some data. This is one way of expressing that Australia has a variable climate. So Birchmore and Gibson, Melanie Birchmore went out and she spoke to beekeepers, this is all Victorian data, and used beekeeper knowledge about eucalypt flowering. And she used beekeepers because there's very few records on eucalypt flowering. People have observed that they flower rarely, but this is a good example of citizen science. Those beekeepers might not have thought of themselves as scientists, but they had the best records available on variation in flowering. And so the way to read this table here is across the top, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that's how often do you flower? Do you flower every 1 year, every 2 years, every 3 years, and so on? And then I've got lots of different species going down in the column. And so you can look at, larger florins. The M says that's the mode, that's the typical kind of flowering. So larger florins typically flowers every 2 years, but some beekeepers report places where it flowers every year. Okay? So what I want you to see here is that most eucalypts are not flowering every year. So the M's are mostly in the column 2 and 3 and even 4. So these guys, Dives, are flowering only every 4 years or something. And then, not only are most of them not flowering every year, but even within the species there's variation. So Macrorinca, the typical pattern is they're flowering every 4 years, but some of them every 3, some of them every 5, 6 and 7. So that, in Australia, we actually think of that as reasonably normal. Elsewhere in the world, that's not normal. The normal pattern is seasonal and annual flowering. Most plants around the world flower annually. Some plants flower continuously. But in the Australian landscape, we've got these plants that are adapted to this interannual flowering. Is that a question?
Yeah, are you saying that the plants within an area are all synchronised to flower at the same
No.
time?
So a little bit of that. It's often patchy, but it's more about what an individual does. And often the patch will do a similar thing, but not. So it's messy. How's that for an answer? It's messy. It's not fully synchronised. And it's one of these things that we know remarkably little about this. You might think that something like how often do eucalypts flower would be a fundamental question for Australian ecologists to answer. And there's plenty of people interested in it. We don't know the answer. We know it's to do with rain and whatever, but we can't predict clearly when are the eucalypts going to flower next. Beekeepers struggle with all this all the time because their whole business is founded on knowing when the next flowering event is. But the way they typically do it is by searching around the landscape, using their binoculars and saying, I can see buds now, so it's probably good for the flowering season. Okay, so that's kind of the norm, and that's what animals have evolved with. So this data here, let's just focus on this cell here. We've got increasing rain down on the x-axis, and then range size. So that's how many different places across the landscape does a given honeyeater, each dot is a species, how many different places does a given honeyeater exist. So what this is showing, pretty simply, is as you get to wetter and wetter climates, the range for a given honeyeater species gets smaller. So if you're in a wet climate, you can live in a fairly small area. If you're in a dry climate, you have to have a big area. And that's because you need that big area to find those flowering events. So many of you would know that honeyeaters are often described as nomadic, meaning that they don't move highly predictably and seasonally. They actually have to scout the whole landscape, like a beekeeper does, to find when's that next flowering event going to be. So that's just been part of the honeyeater existence for a long time, and it's expressed most fully in honeyeaters that are adapted to the drier parts of the landscape. So climate variability is something that you can adapt to, and our animals have found their ways. I'm more of a bee researcher, so I'm going to move on to the bees. A few facts about bees. They get everything from flowers. They're totally flower dependent. The nectar is their energy, the pollen is their protein. Pollen's food for babies. There's about 20,000 species globally. So when people talk about bees, they often actually mean honeybees. Honeybees is one in this pool of 20,000 species. There's 2,000 or 3,000 species in Australia. We don't even really know because not enough people study them. But the big one I wanted to get here is that although we know that honeybees are social, and we've got these stingless bees that Cormac's got the Speaker of the House looking after, is another social bee, and bumblebees, which unfortunately occur in Tasmania, but their natural distributions are in Europe and Asia. They're social, but in fact most bees are not social. I sometimes call them lonely, which is unfair. They're probably perfectly happy living alone, but they're not doing the whole caring for young, queen, all that kind of stuff. And one of the interesting things about that is all of these not social bees, which dominate the landscape, they can have populations that vary a lot between years, just like an annual plant does. So they might have a great year and then a not great year. I've misjudged my timing, so I'm going to move faster. I'm going to talk about a bee survey we did. This is in Canberra, near the intersection of William Slim Drive and the Barton Highway. Not a remarkable area in which to survey for bees. But what we found over this period, I think it's 8 years, this is just the variability in the number of species right? So we found 33 species in this pretty ordinary corner of Canberra, 33 over this whole time period, and it bounces around, right? But every year we were getting up to, well, we were getting at peaks between sort of 8 and 10 species in a given month, okay? So every year is different, but most species kept coming out. But the numbers of individuals vary like mad. So in our first year, we've got these really big numbers, so there's a peak up to sort of 500 in our trap in a month. We thought, wow, these bees are super abundant. 2 years later, we got almost nothing. We thought, my God, this is the end of the bees. And then, you know, then there was a better year, and then we had a huge year again. So that just reflects this issue that these bees, they're annual, they can have explosive good years, they can almost disappear for a year, and then they can reappear again. So we shouldn't panic when we see low numbers. We should know that that's part of the cycle they live in. In this case, I can tell you that bees actually don't like spring rain that much. As the rainfall for spring goes up, the number of bees in our trap goes down. I think that's just because it's not great weather for flying, the same reason we don't like rain, although we don't fly. That's a bad analogy. This is typical of a scientist. To demonstrate that flowers are more abundant in the rain, I've got some data, but we sort of know that, right? If a good season, you're going to get more flowers, right? So the rain's good for the food for the bees, but it might be bad for the flying of the bees. So there's complex interactions there. But to get back to my main message, we should expect annual populations to fluctuate, and we should expect that there are complicated interactions between the weather, between flower abundance, and between availability of nesting habitat, which I haven't had time to talk about. So what should we do if we're worried about supporting bees through a variable climate? It gets back to the core things that a few people have already mentioned, but I'm just going to mention them again because they're so important. The first one is actually to protect the remaining habitat. So there's been a lot of talk about planting habitats in urban areas, and that's fantastic. But let's not forget, there's still native bushland out there that we need to be protecting, because that's always going to be the best habitat. So we should be working to protect remnant habitats, but then we should be taking these opportunities to restore diverse flowers in diverse places. Other speakers have already talked about that, but I really want to emphasise it's not just diversity of flowering. You want them in different kinds of places. So you get some places that might be a bit wetter in that season, or might have a slightly richer soil, and so on. So you really want to get both kinds of diversity. And then we know that insecticides kill insects. That's what the word means. And so we shouldn't be using insecticides more broadly than is absolutely necessary. And I'm sorry I went a few minutes over time. Thank you.